Good morning, good morning. This is the ninth episode of FAFO and Chill, in which the Chainstack Developer Experience team talks about the various things we've been building and exploring within the Web3 space over the past few weeks. In classic Web3 fashion, we spent a lot of time exploring new Web3 technologies and building various tools. FAFO and Chill is where we talk about these things and dive into the world of Web3 tech. Today, we're going to talk about a topic that I'm particularly passionate about. I'm always very excited to talk about this because it is very nuanced and you can dive into so many different layers of it. So this topic is going to be Web3 data, specifically the sort of nuances of querying Web3 data, interacting with Web3 data, and the different means of doing this, right? So for a quick overview, you have things like, of course, base RPC nodes, stuff like that. You can get into subgraphs and then into data APIs and eventually even SQL-based querying methods like Dune or Flipside. They recently released Live Query, which does this. So there's a lot of different ways in Web3 to query and work with data. So how do you choose what to use, right? How do you know what works best for your use case? How do you actually get the data that you need, right? I mean, there's so many different ways of doing it. It's like choosing the right cereal box or something. I mean, the options are crazy, and they all have different pros and cons. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be kind of diving into the world of data querying and data interaction within Web3. But before we dive too deep into that, first we can go through the sort of standard speaker lineup that we have today. I think in the future we're going to be bringing some guests on, so keep an eye out for that next week and the weeks following that. But today we have the usual three speakers to start. You have me. My name is Ethan. I go by the alias Tabasco online, and I am the developer relations lead here at Chainstack. With me, I have Ake, our director of developer experience, as well as David, our developer advocates lead. So what's up, guys? How are you guys doing today?
Hello. We're doing good. Thanks.
I'm curious, just before we kind of go into too many rabbit holes here, I'm curious what you guys think about this overall topic, Web3 data accessibility. Right, so I mentioned a few key technologies there. Of course, as an infrastructure provider, we deal with this a lot. We deal with different technologies and different ways of querying with Web3 data. Specifically, of course, we do a lot of RPC node stuff. So, global Elastic nodes, very efficient and sort of enhanced RPC nodes, right? Which are actually, typically the most common way of querying and interacting with the blockchain, right? So this is what most people use, but of course there are a lot of sort of extraneous solutions to this. So maybe, if we want, we can start with you in terms of what are your thoughts on data querying in general? Of course, you've been in the Web3 space a lot longer than I have, so I'm sure you've been able to witness the evolution of this vertical firsthand. So what are your thoughts on this kind of topic in general right now?
Yeah, so I think data in Web3 is probably second best to the blockchain itself, to the blockchain technology itself. It's even up, I think it's bigger and it's a lot more fun, it's a lot more interesting than the AI part to which, everybody's flocking into AI right now. But data itself is not really solid, and there is just so much to explore and so much to do. It's very, very cool. And then, for starters, I think data only started on the path of being figured out pre-last bull run, probably about 2018, 2019. People started thinking about, what do we do with data, as in really trying to figure it out. Because before that, before ICOs, and all the stuff, it might have not been as important because it was mostly transactions, smart, simplistic smart contracts. In there, outside of maybe the what was the kitten game on what was it called? Ethereum Kitties in 2017, I think. 2018. But outside of that, I think there wasn't too much use for data. But what's going on right now is, and then DeFi summer really changed that. Everybody started, everybody really wanted the data because you need to look into this. And the blockchain itself is not really optimized for this. You can't, really easily in a live way to extract the data so they can serve it to the end user in the classic Web2 fashion where it's readily available. And when you talk data, then there is a lot of things going on. So one is centralized, versus decentralized, and what types of data you need to have in there. 2 is kind of decentralized application accessibility with the data itself. So I'm being a little bit vague, I guess, but we can talk examples in here. For example, the subgraphs, everybody's favorite kind of topic, subgraphs, which is a lot of the graph project has decentralization in mind, in its implementation, but a lot of projects are just using this pretty cool solution that's already available in there in a centralized way, because they only really need to index the blockchain data and serve it to the end user, and they don't really need to decentralize data outside of this. So that's fun. But then there is also SQL compatibility. That's another one where a lot of developers and a lot of software studios that I talk to, they really prefer the data to be SQL compatible, SQL compatible, because a lot of developers, that's just the default way of interacting with the data, and doing those solutions. That's another thing. The other one is data, the location of the data. Because again, if we are going to see the institutions adopt Web3 in a major way, then a lot of them, and it's something we are seeing with centralized exchanges currently as well. But the more they are regulated, the more regulation there is, the more data solutions, I think, they would need to be either run on the premises of the of what physically or in some way belongs to the company that's providing the solution. For example, if we had, I'm not sure what Gemini is using or Coinbase are using, but if we but they are heavily regulated, then I would think they're either going with some that's turnkey solution like AWS, which is turnkey for all the legal stuff as well, where you keep the customer data and all the data and all that stuff, or they're using some maybe they're on their own servers somewhere, but they need to keep the data on premises regardless, even if it's even if it's the data taken off a public blockchain, they might still enrich all of this and kind of dump the enriched data into their own servers and their own databases. And then there are other things as well, like Flick Network. Actually, good time to mention Flick Network. They are coming up with something that's called with the new AAP for Ethereum, something they call NFAs, which is a pretty cool concept of non-fungible applications, where the idea is that you actually store the kind of a way to access very, very simple code, front end code to access to interact with the application on chain, right? So that you don't get this kind of fungible intermediary things that get between you and the smart contract that you're interacting with. So another layer of security in there. And then there are other types as well when you talk centralization and decentralization of data. For example, recently I was thinking, what if Etherscan, for example, we talk Ethereum specifically, but it's the same issue for other EVM chains and maybe non-EVMs as well. What if Etherscan goes down? Where am I going to get all this API data, right? Where is all this API data stored right now? And I was thinking how, it'll be a good idea to get all this API data. And I think it's, last time I checked, it's like 60 million contracts on Ethereum or something. It's just, I retrieved the number of contracts and the contract address of Ethereum, and it was like 2.5 gigabytes, I think. I did it a couple of months ago. So if I want to interact with all this bytecode deployed on Ethereum, where do I get all this data if Etherscan goes down? and I didn't find a readily available solution. It would be cool to retrieve all of this stuff or to get all of these ABI data of Etherscan, just dump it somewhere on APFS and keep updating it from there. But doing this through Etherscan API is just not feasible because I tried doing that. There are more contracts deployed than you'd be able to retrieve if you start from when Ethereum started. So that's another point of data, which is also important, right? So there are different ways. One is there are different aspects to this. One is a blockchain network itself is not really built for the purpose of having an index data readily available for queries. That's where you get all these other solutions like Subgraphs and Flipside, crypto, and all this other stuff, Covalent, and that. Two is securing the way you interact with the smart contract, whereby you have something like NFA, non-fungible application, I think being championed right now, pioneered by Flick. And three is centralized and decentralized. I don't think all the data needs to be decentralized, but with the case with useful stuff like KBIs, there probably should be another layer of redundancy. And I know there are developers that just keep locally to themselves all this ABI data. I know for sure they do, and they just keep retrieving all the new stuff that's getting deployed, just to have it useful and available for them in case either scan goes down. Just another layer of protection. So there is a lot to explore. That's my kind of take to get started.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. The ABI problem is huge. Right now you have to either, and I do this all the time whenever I'm interacting with a contract, it's always like, you go to Etherscan, you find the contract, and you copy the ABI and throw it in your code. That's how you do it, right? Or you can use their API, and there's different ways to do it, but It is a centralization problem. And I think we actually talked about this not too long ago on, I think, one of our recent podcasts. We talked about the centralization versus decentralization of data accessibility, of data querying. I was specifically like RPC infrastructure and stuff like that, key data infrastructure. And it's always the question of, I don't think going 100% decentralized on everything, like you mentioned, is necessarily the goal. But I think the goal is decentralizing the things that can benefit from it, and in a way, maintaining centralization on things where decentralization would either harm that use case, or whatever it may be. I think is generally good. So, for example, there's some things that need to remain decentralized, right? Like you have like a base layer of data available on the blockchain. Right, address, transaction information, block information, smart contract information, event emissions, etc. Right, these are things that you can directly query on chain and are very easy to query. But in the same reign, a lot of this data has major walls and limitations. Right, so when we're just looking at this specific group of data, when we're just looking at blocks, transactions, addresses, stuff like that. If I want to right now figure out the third most transaction I ever did on my Ethereum wallet, you can't do it on Ethereum by default with RPC requests or really any way, even with unless you indexed every single block and looked for transactions and found my first one and then counted from there. I mean, the architecture of blockchain makes it really difficult for these kind of unique data tasks. And these are fundamental blockers in data accessibility. And then you pile on top of this like ABIs, for example, right? The fact that, we're reliant on Etherscan and different explorers to provide these key pieces of data, and even in the same way, we also rely on them to provide that sort of historical transaction data, like I mentioned, right? If we want to find the first transaction that a contract ever executed or whatever, then you have to go through Etherscan or whatever to find that, or some API or something. And of course,
that was a cool solution your guys doing. Yeah, I remember now. Yeah,
That's a work in progress.
Right. Yeah, there's a few key solutions to this. Of course, you have Covalent, for example, right? This is one thing. I'm a big fan of Covalent personally, but of course, the way that they do it is pretty complicated in terms of how to handle all that data. But like covalent, for example, is one way to get historical transactions, and you're doing it without the presence of an explorer, right? But you also have things like Novas, for example, which actually are one of our most recent marketplace integrations. They do something very similar where they allow you to get essentially just illicit transactions, historical transactions for an address. And of course, it's something that we've been, we created the Covalent SDK, and we've even recently been doing some like code snippets and stuff like that for, like for example, if you want to find every transaction that's going to an address, right? Let's say to my main address, I want to get pinged every time I get a transaction or something. Then the way that you do this, if you want to actually know what that transaction is that you subscribe to new blocks and you look through the block and see if it includes a transaction to me. I mean, this is just like kind of a ridiculous way of doing it. That you're looking at every single new block on the blockchain and checking it if it includes a transaction. I mean, the point here is that data has, especially in Web3 with blockchain technology, has significant inherent limitations. And I think these are key blockers. And I think in the same light, though, these limitations have always existed. And I think as we go into this year and even next year, I feel like we're very close to almost like a sort of data renaissance, if that makes sense, right? We have a lot of solutions that are coming up right now that are making accessing this data, or just data accessibility in Web3 in general, much easier, right? And we'll get into it in a moment. But you have things like you mentioned, Flipside and Dune and stuff like this that make complicated data that typically would be very, very difficult to get on chain, right? Natively on chain with like RPC requests, for example, significantly easier. But that's just kind of my main overview. David, I'm also curious to know what you think about this topic in general. Your thoughts on the state of data in Web3. Of course, we talked about the various different limitations and stuff like that. But what do you think about data as it exists right now in Web3? Do you think we're in a good place? Do you think that we have a lot of room to grow? What are your thoughts on that?
In one word, is a mess. We actually get quite a few users or customers come in and say, "Hey, I am trying to do this. How can I do it with your RPC service?" I'm like, you will have to index the whole thing. It's gonna take months.
By the way, it's
or you go
it's
to
one
Covalent,
of the a lot of developers come into Web3 expecting hey, it's public blockchain, which means all the data should be readily available,
public,
and it's not, right? It's like that's one of the biggest misconceptions, misunderstandings. And
so it's relatively difficult to access that way, and
it's pretty
very
cool
slow.
though.
And then we kind of loop around and go back to centralizing the data again, because the data is decentralized on the nodes, but then if Etherscan and Covalent and whatever other couple of providers go down, then where is the data? Oh, we have to reindex everything from zero. Like, it cannot be how you work in 2023, It's subgraphs are a very good way to handle this, but they also have their limitations. Like, as far as I know, you can't index every transaction, It has to be from a smart contract and such. So it's
well, it's such a huge pitfall, but it's pretty cool as well. I mean, like, developers, they start and again, like Ethan, I think you mentioned correctly, data is in a renaissance, because I think like a couple of years ago, and even before that, everybody was doing Solidity smart contracts. But what started being developed after this is more on the infrastructure side. Everybody's doing like wallets, services, indexing services, and data services, and whatever, which is very cool, which is what I love seeing. And then developers come in, and they, a lot of them, again, they think, hey, what's like, Go Ethereum is using, what was it using? LevelDB, for example. I don't remember specifically. They're using this database, so we should be able to, and then we should be able to query it like normally, and it's all out there. It's all available. You don't even need any sort of authentication to access a blockchain network. And then there's this huge pitfall of, yes, you can do that, but it's going to take you like 3 months for just to loop through all of this stuff. and get what you want.
Yeah.
And it's really, it's pretty cool seeing this. And it's like, okay, now what do I do?
Yeah.
What do I do now? And then you kind of think all of this is sophisticated and it's all available. You can do all of this stuff, but then when you go into specific tasks that you have, you just keep hitting roadblocks left and right, and a lot of the times you'd go to you'd go down the path that you should not be going, but just because you're learning how to do this. And then again, just walking through those practical examples is pretty cool to kind of give people the idea of the data challenges that we have, or the data situation. Like, to give you an example, again, been talking to software studios recently quite a bit, and they do for centralized exchanges. And then, believe it or not, there are more and more centralized exchanges popping up, interestingly enough, and they need their own data solutions to do all those like on-chain confirmations before they can release the funds and all this stuff. And when you go into this, it's pretty interesting. Like, some of the networks, for example, they have chain reorgs. So just having like several confirmations is not enough for them. Some of those centralized exchanges, when they implement a data solution developed by those software studios, which are always custom solutions, by the way, and they are always SQL compatible. That's what they do. Is they do like double check for each of the confirmation to make sure it's not, the chain that they are indexing the data from is not reorg. So it's just one of the examples. Another example is, again, a few months ago, I was just playing around, and I wanted to do like a very, very simple thing, which is doing a contract. Like, for example, having a Twitter bot that does that checks the past 100, like for example 100 blocks on Ethereum, and tells you what the hottest contract is. Right, so for the hottest contract, and it was basically part of all this meme token mania. And I was thinking, it would be cool if I had a Twitter bot that would tweet like every half an hour the hottest contract for the past like 100 blocks or 300 blocks, and then it needs to filter out all the USDT. All the known, like in Uniswap routers and all the known contracts which are not meme contracts. It needs to do only just tokens, and then it needs to, well, how do you do that? So for each block, or for the past 100 blocks, you need to take all the transactions, retrieve all the transactions from each of the blocks, and check the contract addresses of those blocks that contract addresses of those transactions interacted with, and get the top one, right? And then if you want the name of the contract, you need to retrieve the name of this contract from somewhere where it's verified, which is either a scan 99% of the cases, or maybe 100 at this point. And then like this simple kind of thing that you say, hey, it's all public data, it's all public blockchain. You don't even need an archive node, right? Because you're always dumping the data, and then just then the analytics kind of on the fly. But this simple kind of solution, it requires a lot of processing, a lot of retrieval, a lot of and there is no like readily available solution either for this to be doing this on the fly. So anywhere you go, you just start hitting, you just need to kind of invent stuff, which is pretty cool, but which is also the state of where we are today in 2023. And you guys can also do a quick walkthrough, I guess, which was a pretty cool thing of how they actually identify the first contract deployed by an account, I guess, right? That was some that we looked into recently, which on the surface, again, is pretty simple. But if you guys can give a quick walkthrough, so that then the walkthrough through something that is practical, I think is always a good story to illustrate the issues we have with data today.
Yeah, for sure. So, the contract deployment piece of it, right? Trying to figure out, how many contracts have been deployed on the specific wallet, when were they deployed? What was the first one like this? This was an interesting task because, I think it was Albert from Dform. He tweeted about it, and he said, "Who has an API that can tell me if somebody has deployed a contract or not?" Right? So I was tweeting, and I was, that has to exist. It must be pretty easy, right? I mean,
which is right. It seems obvious, right? Yeah. That's a lot of those things. You're like, wow. I mean, even we've been in this space for years at this point. And that is, well, of course the solution would exist like that. I mean, it's something simple. Imagine Web2 guys coming into this and think, I mean, you guys have been like 10 plus years, right? The blockchains, yeah. And then it's just a pitfall on every step, which is super fun. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, it was crazy. And because then I looked in the comments and I was like, wait, nobody's linking anything. There's like no solution.
Right.
And I was like,
right.
And then I started coding and I was like, okay, this isn't as easy as you think. And I was asking ChatGPT, and like, of course, that's what I do for most things. And there was no solution. So what I figured out is I was like, well, this is actually, because this was when we were figuring this problem out. This was around the same time that we were building the Covalent SDK. And of course, for anybody listening that isn't aware, Covalent is a really cool data API provider. I'm a big fan of it because I personally use it all the time. It's a very easy way to solve a lot of these key data problems, right? Finding historical transactions, finding contract event logs, NFT holders, token holders, stuff like that. I mean, anything you can think of pretty much. And, things that would typically be impossible just with like basic JSON RPC calls straight to the blockchain. So we're making an SDK for this because we integrated them onto our marketplace. And we wanted an easier way to query Covalent with the Chainstack API keys. So as we were making this, I came across this tweet and I was like, well, I think we can make a method for this. We can make a function for finding all of the contracts deployed by an address. But if you want to do this without a data API, so without something like Covalent, you're faced with the problem of, well, number one, you need to find all of the transactions that a wallet has sent. This is already difficult. If you want to do this without a data API, okay, loop through every block since Genesis, basically, or whatever, right. And like see, log down whenever this address pops up, right? And that's just a huge pain. And that's maybe we do it. And now once you have like a list of every transaction that a wallet has done, right, there you go. Now you need to qualify, well, which one of these are contract deployments? And I forget the exact conditional that we had in there, but there was some way of a pretty easy way of determining when something was.
I think it was zero.
I think it was something like that.
Null is a target address. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it was some specific recipient address that indicated that it was a contract creation instead of like a peer-to-peer transaction or something. So we integrated that, and we relied on the function of Covalent that essentially allows you to get a paginated, which I think is how you pronounce it. I can never paginated, whatever. It gets a paginated like list of transactions. So it's like, here's 10 pages of transactions. What this function essentially does is it goes through each page in the list and loops through each transaction. It says, is this transaction, does it meet the conditional for a smart contract deployment? If it does, it adds it to the list. If it doesn't, it doesn't. So, I mean, even with like the super just like on a silver platter, here's a list of transactions. Even then, you have to do all this extra looping and calls, stuff like that, to figure out if it qualifies as a smart contract deployment. Now, if you take away the data API component and just try to do this with the blockchain, it's a nightmare. This is something that like would be almost impossible unless you were super dedicated to it and like wanted to spin up indexers and stuff like that. So like this is a key thing. And like another example, I guess I'll kind of provide two quick examples here. When I was building Amity DeFi a few years ago, I wanted to Amity DeFi, for some quick context, is essentially a wallet that you can interact with through Discord. You can send people tokens and Ethereum and whatever, any EVM chain. And when I was doing this, I wanted a way to display what token somebody owns natively in Discord, right? So I wanted to figure out, do you have 10 USDC? Do you have 2 USDT? Whatever, right? But when I was doing this, I did all the research, and it's a little bit easier to do now. But back then, there wasn't really any APIs or anything. I don't even think Covalent really was existed really back then. And I figured out, I was like, well, this is really hard to do, right? Finding all of the tokens that a specific address owns is difficult, right? And like all the suggestions were like, well, you have to either loop through, same thing, like the blockchain, and figure out where there's like interactions with different contracts and everything, and transfer events. And I mean, it becomes really complicated. So eventually I was just like, well, I'm not gonna be able to do this natively on the blockchain. I'm not gonna be able to know what tokens people have. Of course, Etherscan can do this. You can go to Etherscan, you can figure out, oh, I have this token, I have that token. But I figured it out, and I was like, well, all I'm going to have to do here is ask people what tokens they have, right? I mean, say, do you think you have this token? If you do, you can add it to your wallet. And then what it did is I created this function where you can add tokens to your wallet, and then it will essentially tell the bot, next time you query your balance, include this token in the balance of function calls or whatever, right? Which is the kind of native, universal almost token balance call. Right, so it can get complicated, but as eventually I just gave up because there was no way of doing it at the time. Now, of course, you have Covalent, and you have even like the Etherscan API that can do this for you. But it's stuff like that is pretty interesting. And then, the other thing was last night, right? It was super late, and I got this message. This guy he had a trading strategy that he wanted to implement. He didn't want me to share exactly what it is, but it was kind of an interesting way of trading and stuff like that. But his goal was to essentially find every Uniswap swap that happens, right, and look at the details of that transaction. So whenever I swap 2 ETH for some USDC, we needed to index that and see when that happens. Now, of course, this is another thing where it's just like, well, this is very difficult to do, because the thing is, especially with the Uniswap router, is that you don't have event emissions every time a swap happens. So you're basically stuck in the same place as some of the other things where you just have to look at the blockchain and figure out when something happens. So I spent all this time last night trying to create this for this guy. I essentially just turned into a script that we actually posted a recipe on our dev portal recently. We posted a very similar recipe that does something along these lines. And essentially what this does is it looks through every new block on Ethereum, every single block, and it looks through every single transaction. And if the transaction contains to the V2 Uniswap router, then that goes into the conditional. And then it looks to see if that transaction contains a certain signature, method ID, method signature. It's like a few random string characters and numbers, stuff like that. That would indicate a swap exact ETH for tokens method, right? Which indicates buying a token essentially. So I mean the script is like 50 lines long, and it's just like a bunch of random numbers and letters, and if you haven't been in Web3 for a long time, you look at that, I mean, it looks ridiculous, right? Versus in like Web2, data problems like these would just be like, yeah, you just like call this API or you do whatever. So I mean, these things are like Web3, in my opinion, is like pretty primitive in this sense, in that, and in a lot of ways, this is an inherent limitation of blockchain, especially with EVM chains. And I think it's a little bit different with things like Solana and stuff like that, but this is just like how they work, and you have to rely on centralized infrastructure if you want to get past these issues, right? So on like different data APIs and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, that was kind of like the key example that I had. And of course, to quickly go through a few examples, I'm curious what you guys think about this. Specifically like the solutions. Go ahead.
Yeah, just wanted to add something quickly, which is you again, as always with practical examples, I love going through those. You bring up an interesting scenario in which which brings up a question of the kind of good hygiene of implementing emit events, right? Event emissions in the contract, because you can't make developers do event emissions, right? You can say, hey, that'll be good if you guys were doing this, but then because it's not a requirement, then for your data analytics, when you're implementing, you can't really rely on this as much. So you have to fall to the lowest common denominator, which is not really having event emissions. In those, if you're doing a bunch of different smart contracts analytics, which means again you're falling into this data analytics in the kind of rawest form. Yeah, that was something that I really wanted to mention. It's a cool thing, but you always you don't get data automatically enriched or by default enriched from smart contract developers. Login might be even a bigger problem in Web3 because you're not doing this. Like for your company, you're not doing this, because it's all out there, open source and visible to everybody, and others are going to be using this. You're not really, unless you're with, unless when you're implementing your smart contract, you think everybody's going to be interacting with this and you really want to do good, you're not really incentivized, or you're not, by either the open source community or by your company guidelines or whatever. If you're like a developer, a non-basement type of developer, you're not really incentivized to make your contract login the best possible so that the job is easier for the other ones, right? And because the majority of contract development, 60 million contracts, even more probably deployed on Ethereum, you're not really incentivized to be doing any of this, and thus the topic of data indexing is even more fun, and which makes which again is the same thing that I think we discussed last time, is the foundational layer for the blockchain networks is great. I think it's awesome. It's very unique. It's just that's what Web3 is. It's immutable. It's there. It's invincible. That's what I think. Like for Ethereum, for example, the security is just insane. But to make it easier for others, or to make it actually manageable, you need other infrastructure providers, data providers, whatever companies working to make your life easier. And the more complex it gets, the more solution providers you need. So that's something I wanted to mention.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good point that kind of brings me to an interesting segue in that, right now, like I mentioned briefly before, there's a few key ways of interacting with data, right? So, of course, like the most common way is just simple JSON RPC calls, right? And this is where like you hit most of your limitations. So that's where you're going to see limitations in basically everything that we talked about, from like data accessibility. And these are calls just like get block, get transaction, get balance, stuff like that, just general calls that everybody's familiar with. And these are great, and of course we've made a lot of improvements as a community in RPC nodes and RPC accessibility and performance and reliability and availability, stuff like that. This has made huge strides over the past few years, and it's easier than ever now to get started building with RPC. And even if you aren't using it primarily for data readability, they're still of course integral to your application, just for the connection component. But when we're just looking at data readability, right, actually gathering data from the blockchain, there's a lot of solutions now that have been made for the primary purpose of filling in the gaps kind of left by like that very base layer data querying that you can do within RPCs. So one of these is of course Subgraphs. Subgraphs is this is something that we're very passionate about. We've been spending a lot of time working with and trying to make it easier for people to launch and stuff like that in a more reliable and kind of widely accessible manner. So Subgraphs are great if, right, this is a big conditional, they're great if you're indexing a contract that has like regular event emissions, and you can stuff like that you can easily spin up. Like for example, Bored Ape Yacht Club, right? This is something that we actually built our tutorials around, the Bored Ape Yacht Club NFT contract, because they have of course transfer emissions like most NFTs do. These different events that you can spin up a subgraph and index these and then query them with GraphQL. So it's very familiar for a lot of developers. It's very reliable. It's high speed. And it's usually for a lot of people the perfect solution when they need that very specific data from contracts that meet that criteria of being accessible in that sense, right? Contracts that are built around that sort of data accessibility that actually emit usable data. So this is of course one solution, Subgraphs, a solution to some problems, and then you have other things like we mentioned, data APIs, right? Covalent, Novas, a few other guys that essentially, they've done all that indexing for you. So now you can kind of query the data that you might not have direct access to traditionally. And now you also have things like SQL-based data providers, right? So when I say SQL-based, I mean things like Flipside Live Query, which is something pretty cool that we're actually currently looking into participating in some sense for some alpha, if anybody's listening to that. But Flipside Live Query is essentially a way to query data on chain through SQL, and it's very familiar to a lot of people. Of course, you can do it through in their platform a variety of RPC providers, a variety of data APIs, stuff like that, which is cool. And then of course you have things like Dune, which is another SQL-based implementation of kind of like this data hub of different things in Web3. So there's a lot of ways, and then even like now, which we're actually going to be launching soon, later this week, ChatGPT. You have even this is like another way to get data that interacts with it's another like aggregation
That's
of
a good
different
point.
data providers.
That's a good point.
Like RPC nodes and data APIs and stuff like that, where you can now query it with natural language, and it's just like another medium of interaction.
Sorry, just a quick note. Yeah, quick note. It's actually a very, very good point. So you have, I was just randomly talking at the start, but you make a very good point. Is it goes blockchain, data, and then AI, right? You can't put AI in front of the data in this tech, right? So that's how important data is. For anyone listening there. Yeah, even to implement an AI solution, you need the data solution first. Right.
Exactly. Right. Like a big part of what we did with the plugin, not to off rails too much here, but we gave ChatGPT access to a variety of data querying sources. So we not only gave ChatGPT direct access to our RPC nodes, to global elastic nodes, stuff like that, we also gave it access to Covalent, right, a data API. So you're giving it like different points of contact, and then of course, instead of querying that programmatically, you can ask it for what you want, and it'll do it for you and figure out like what fits best for your question. So it's another very interesting and new way, kind of unexplored way of interacting with Web3 data. That's just like another alternative to the things that I mentioned before, and even in a lot of ways a means of interacting with the things that I mentioned before. So through these key things, I guess my question to you guys would be, what out of these solutions is your favorite in terms of general data readability, right? Just taking data interaction out of the question, data interaction meaning like writing data to the blockchain, right? Of course, RPC nodes will win in this case, but if we're just talking about data readability, so querying data, figuring things out on chain, what do you guys prefer? Do you guys still prefer the traditional approach, just like querying through blocks and hoping that you can find what you're looking for, or do you like data APIs? Do you think they're decentralized? Do you like subgraphs, SQL-based data providers? What do you guys think about this? Maybe David, you can go ahead and let us know.
In general, I like subgraphs for all smart contract related stuff. I really like subgraph, and I have to say the Chainstack subgraph service that we released is actually making things quite a bit easier to work on these things, so I'm a little biased on that. But I usually try to, the first thing that I try to do is look at subgraph and see if I can do something with those. And then if I can do something with subgraph, then I tend to go the actual RPC vanilla way. To be honest, I kind of like the original way to get data. I don't know, I'm relatively comfortable with how that's working, and I can kind of figure out what I need. It's not always the best option, obviously. The example of pulling smart contracts is the best example. Why spending months by myself if I can just go to Covalent and do it for super cheap and super quick? Yeah, it's kind of my take on that.
Yeah, definitely the subgraphs component. Good.
Yeah, I love subgraphs. Yeah, obviously, but I really want a unified, kind of like open API spec. I want something like this, which is also SQL compatible, standard way that unifies the data indexing for all those networks, right?
Yeah.
And it's something our CTO, by the way, mentioned. So we might do it at some point. It's a very cool idea. It's an obvious thing to do. But yeah, I really want a data API that is standard and that is SQL compatible. That's what I want to have.
That's gonna be pretty game changing. And keep in mind that what I've been noticing in this time that I've been in basically the technology environment, the data is really the important stuff. It doesn't even matter what you do.
Yeah.
Like if you provide data, then you're set. You know, it doesn't even matter if your service changes the world, if it's useful. You provide data, you're good for a long time. So kind of sucks, I guess, but it's what it is.
Yeah, I think the company that figures out that data problem, I think the unified idea, like trying to figure out like how do we combine, like, you know, I just mentioned what was like 6 different ways of interacting with data. And it's like, you know, some they all have pros and cons. Like some are good, some are bad. For certain different use cases, it's like, you know, do we really need like all these different ways of getting like the same piece of data basically? So like, you know, having one way that kind of takes the pros from each of these and creates sort of like a one size fits all. I know it's sort of like a dream almost, because this thing that we're talking about would be very difficult to actually create
New
because
side
of the nuances of
project.
blockchain. Yep, yeah, let's start.
New side project idea. Because we don't have enough of those.
We don't have enough. Right.
I have like
Yeah,
10 that I went like 25%, and then
yeah. We have a Notion page called Dev Projects, and it's like just massive. We have a million things. Every day it's like, this thing would be pretty cool if we made it. And it's like, yeah, let's add it to the list.
let's add it to the list.
Right.
It's such a cool industry to be in, right? It's just insane amount of things that are you actually need to do that are useful, right? And you just don't have time to. Yeah, it's just basically you picking what. Yeah, you know, it's pretty cool.
It's the golden age of Web3 right now. Is there's so many problems, especially I think this data problem is probably one of the biggest problems. Like just finding a like good source of data that, you know, is easy to query, it's comfortable, familiar, that doesn't have, you know, like walls and like significant accessibility issues. Which like all these methods that I mentioned have issues of their own, right? They all have like places where they kind of fall off in terms of, you know, what they can actually provide, and then other solutions pick it up, and then they potentially don't have other. I mean, you know, each of them are good in their own right for different things. And I think, yeah, whoever solves this problem will be huge. And Web3 in general, you know, there's so many of these problems, right, that replicate pretty much what we're talking about in terms of just like, you know, there's solutions that kind of work, but still it's a major problem that haven't been solved yet. Like, you know, I mean, you can go on for hours in terms of like, this is a problem, and we haven't fixed this, and we haven't done this correctly. And I think that, yeah, pretty much. But it's good. That means that, you know, right now is the time to solve these problems. And, you know, whoever is smart enough to figure out the answer and figure out how to do these things, well, you know, this is like an industry it's like a very early internet-like in terms of just like there's so much opportunity and so many things that can be built and utilizations of the technology that haven't been built yet. That it's just a matter of time before like these things are figured out and, you know, people start building cool things. Like I have notepads that are just like random ideas that I have, and I'm like, oh, this would be cool. This would be cool. I should, you know, I gotta work on this. And of course, I do it very slowly, but yeah, there's just so much cool stuff. And I think hopefully, my hope is that like now that we're approaching this sort of time period of a data renaissance, if that's the right word to use, maybe we're not quite there yet. Maybe we are, but I think that especially going into next year, right, as things start to pick up speed, as I think they are right now, this component of Web3, especially as people start moving into the space. We just had PayPal that announced their stablecoin, right? Especially as organizations, large organizations, institutions move into Web3, this data problem is going to have to be solved if we want to move forward, in any significant capacity. So I think that like kind of forceful need within the industry will result in something pretty exciting. That's my hope, at least. But I think we are approaching the end of our time today. I think talked a lot, right? We mentioned all the different kind of types of data, the key problems with data, some examples, some, you know, very interesting examples of just like you know, where direct blockchain interfacing kind of goes wrong, and you know, we can see the limitations of that very easily, and where some solutions pick up that slack and, you know, introduce some extra problems, stuff like that. But I'm very excited about the future of this vertical and kind of where this is going. And of course at Chainstack, this is a big focus for us, trying to make it easier for developers to interact with Web3. A big part of that, of course, is data. We just released Subgraphs. We have some various, you know, partner data APIs, some stuff coming in that same realm. We're even introducing like data storage solutions. The list goes on of things that we're trying to build to improve the general usability experience for developers in Web3. So this is, of course, a big focus of ours, and we're going to continue working on this. And, of course, working with partners, which hopefully we should have some news about soon, to continue pushing on this front and eventually, continually create a better environment for developers. But before we end it off here, David and Ake, were there any final thoughts and key topics that you guys wanted to touch on real quick?
Yeah, just shout out to all those builders building the all the data stuff like Covalent and Flipside. I love them. They're super awesome.
They really make life easier.
And we're doing a space with Flipside tomorrow, and then
nice.
We'll have some partnerships with them soon. We'll see. Who knows? But right now we have, of course, Covalent, Novez, and a few other guys. Of course, Subgraphs, just like as a base offering. We have we're very involved with the data space, and as an organization, we're very excited to see where it goes, and definitely full support to everybody that's pushing the boundaries on that, pushing boundaries on data querying and accessibility. I think that's about it. Very interesting discussion today. We do these FAFO and Chill episodes every week. We post them every week on Friday, and we go through various different topics throughout the industry, whether it's some stuff like this, data accessibility. Last week we did it about Web3 security and meme coins and stuff like that. It is pretty volatile, the topics here, but this is definitely a topic that I'm always excited to talk about. So this will be posted this Friday, and you can catch episode 10, which will be next week on Friday.